History is not just a collection of dates, but a tapestry of stories, some true, many invented. None is more persistent than the myth of the cake. Let them eat cake. E. These 5 words have defined Marie Antoinette for centuries, casting her as the ultimate symbol of royal heartlessness. But those who were there, who saw the woman behind the titles, knew a different truth. They saw a human heart struggling against the weight of a dying crown. To understand the fall of Marie Antoinette, we must first look to where she began, in the imperial splendor of 18th century Vienna. She was born Maria Antonia, the 15th child of the formidable Empress Maria Theresa, a child of the Habsburgs, the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Her mother was a woman of iron will, who viewed her children as instruments of statecraft. Antonia was to be the ultimate peace offering. Her childhood was relatively relaxed for a princess, filled with music and play. But in the Habsburg court, children were primarily currency for political alliances. In 1770, a peace treaty was signed between Austria and France. The seal on that treaty was a marriage between the young Antonia and the Dauphin of France. At 14, she left Vienna forever. She would never see her mother again. Her journey to the border was a slow march away from everything she knew. The journey took weeks, passing through lands where she was greeted with both celebration and silent scrutiny. She was a living symbol of a fragile peace. On a neutral island in the Rhine, the remise took place, a symbolic stripping away of her Austrian identity to prepare her for the French throne. She was taken to a pavilion where she was stripped of every stitch of clothing brought from Vienna. Even her beloved dog was taken away. She emerged as Marie Antoinette, the Dauphine of France, a stranger in a land that had been her family's enemy for 200 years. She arrived at Versailles to find a court obsessed with ritual, where every movement was a public performance and every whisper a potential weapon. She met her husband, Louis Auguste, in the forest of Compiègne. He was shy, overweight, and terrified of the responsibilities that lay ahead. The court was a minefield of rank and precedence. One misstep, one forgotten nod, could ignite a scandal that would last for decades. Versailles was a gilded labyrinth. For the young Dauphine, it was also a prison of etiquette that she never quite learned to navigate. The French aristocracy viewed her with suspicion. To them, she was l'Autrichienne, a term that meant the Austrian woman, but sounded like the bitch. But her greatest challenge lay in the bedchamber. Her husband, Louis Auguste, was shy, awkward, and seemingly uninterested in his new bride. For 7 long years, the marriage remained unconsummated. In a court where an heir was everything, the failure was laid entirely at her feet. She endured the lever, the public ritual of being dressed by the highest-ranking women of the court. A daily humiliation she grew to loathe. She clashed with the king's mistress, Madame du Barry. It was a battle of status and morality that further isolated the young princess. In 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox. Suddenly, the young, unprepared couple were the king and queen of France. "God guide us," she wrote. They were too young, too inexperienced, and the crown was already beginning to tarnish. The weight of the world had fallen on their shoulders. Marie Antoinette turned to fashion as a form of expression and armor. Her towering hairstyles and extravagant gowns became the talk of Europe. But beneath the feathers and lace was a woman desperately seeking connection. Her portraits from this time reveal a growing sense of melancholy. To escape the suffocating air of Versailles, Marie Antoinette retreated to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau where she could finally be herself. Here, she could discard the heavy court gowns for simple muslin dresses. She created a rustic fantasy, a place of peace, away from the prying eyes of the court. She built a model farm, the hameau, where she could play at being a shepherdess. To the public, it was another sign of her mocking their poverty. She found solace in the simple routines of the farm, away from the venomous gossip of the palace. But even here, she could not escape the world. While the queen played at farming, the king committed France to the American Revolution. The massive debt incurred would prove to be their undoing. The treasury was draining. The people were suffering from rising bread prices and crushing taxes. Resentment was boiling in the streets of Paris. The pamphlets of Paris, the libelles, began to circulate. They painted her as a spendthrift, a flirt, and eventually a monster of depravity. Finally, after years of struggle, an heir was born. Marie-Thérèse, her first child, brought a brief respite from the political storms. The birth of her children finally gave her the purpose she craved. Those who saw her with them spoke of a devoted, even doting mother. But tragedy struck. She lost her firstborn son to illness just as the revolution was beginning. The queen was grieving as her kingdom crumbled. The public needed someone to blame for the country's ruin. They chose Madame Deficit. Every expense at the Trianon was magnified by the angry press. Bread riots were breaking out. The people were hungry, and they were told their queen was eating brioche while they starved. Then came the affair of the diamond necklace, a grand swindle involving a cardinal, a con artist, and a necklace the queen didn't even want. Cardinal de Rohan, desperate for royal favor, was easily tricked into believing the queen was communicating with him in secret. A tragic folly. The record shows she was completely innocent. But in the eyes of the public, the trial proved her guilt. The crown was tarnished beyond repair. The acquittal of the cardinal was a direct insult to the queen. The public celebrated his release as a victory over her supposed tyranny. It was during this time that the cake quote became attached to her. But Rousseau had attributed it to a great princess years before she arrived in France. When the Bastille fell in July 1789, the world Marie Antoinette knew vanished overnight. The Queen of Versailles was now a target. In October, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding bread. They broke into the palace, seeking the Queen's life. She stepped onto the balcony, facing the muskets alone. Her courage was so absolute that the mob's anger turned, for a moment, to awe. The royal family was forced to move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, a gilded prison where they lived under constant watch. They were no longer rulers, but hostages of the revolution. Every letter was intercepted, every visitor scrutinized. The heart was under siege. In June 1791, they attempted a desperate escape. Disguised as servants, they fled in a heavy carriage toward the border. It was their last hope. In the small town of Varennes, they were recognized. A local postmaster compared the king's face to the image on a coin. The journey was over. The return to Paris was a funeral procession for the monarchy. They were met with silence and glares. The bond between king and people was broken. After the storming of the Tuileries in 1792, they were moved to the Temple prison. Here, the titles were stripped away. She was Widow Capet. The Temple was a medieval tower, cold and damp. The queen spent her days sewing and teaching her children, trying to maintain a shred of normalcy. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Marie Antoinette was left alone, a grieving widow in a cell that smelled of damp and despair. Her final cruelty was the separation from her son, Louis Charles. His cries echoed through the prison as he was taken away to be re-educated. Those who saw her in the Temple spoke of a woman who had aged decades in months. Her health was failing, but her spirit remained unbroken. She was moved to the conciergerie, the antechamber to the guillotine. Her cell was tiny, guarded 24 hours a day by soldiers. Her trial was a mockery of justice. She was accused of treason, depletion of the treasury, and even unspeakable crimes against her own son. When the most horrific accusation was made, she appealed to all mothers in the room. Her dignity was so profound it shamed her accusers. The verdict was never in doubt. Death by the guillotine. She returned to her cell to write one final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth. "I am calm," she wrote, "as one is when the conscience is clear." She apologized to those she might have offended and forgave her enemies. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, she dressed in white. Her hair was cut short. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was taken to the scaffold in a common cart, unlike the king who had a closed carriage. The mob jeered, but she remained composed. She climbed the steps of the scaffold with a steady hand. She had prepared for this moment in the quiet of her cell, finding a peace the world could not touch. Her last words were an apology to the executioner for stepping on his toe. Even at the end, the manners of the princess outlasted the queen. The propaganda that invented her lived on long after she was gone. The "let them eat cake" myth became the primary memory of her life. She was buried in a common grave, but decades later, her remains were moved to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. The queen was finally at rest among her own. But the heart inside the title was something else entirely. A woman who loved, who suffered, and who was ultimately a victim of her time. Marie Antoinette was neither the monster of legend nor the saint of myth. She was a woman of her time, caught in the gears of a world that was breaking. She was a woman who never said, "Let them eat cake," but whose heart was broken by the very people she was born to lead. Which royal heart do you want to hear about next? Whose story has been lost to the shadows of history? Subscribe to Crowns and Sorrows and join us. Thank you for watching. Subscribe and stay for more stories from the shadows of the throne. Your support helps us tell these forgotten tales.